So we're going to talk now about one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, certainly most important of the American philosophers, W.V.O. Willard Van Orman Quine. He is an interesting figure. He sort of marks the transition from logical positivism into post-positivism. In that, he has a lot of sympathies with the logical positivists. There are some assumptions that the positivists had that he shares, and some would say that makes his view archaic, because some of the things that he retains from logical positivism, say his critics, you shouldn't. They should be rejected. But at the same time, his view, and in particular a very famous article, if you had to rank the top analytic philosophy articles of the 20th century, Two Dogmas of Empiricism by W.V.O. Quine would be in the top 5. It certainly was seen as a huge bombshell and was cited and discussed massively in the years after its release in the 50s. And in that paper, he basically attacks logical positivism. Now, reading that paper is very difficult. Quine, in general, writes, I think, beautifully, but does not write clearly. He writes as if his audience is very knowledgeable. It's like coming in the middle of a conversation, a very erudite conversation, and it's very easy to get lost. And what also makes it hard is that Quine's whole philosophy is a big system. There are some philosophical papers that just stand alone, that are talking about a specific topic and making specific points about this specific topic. In fact, probably the majority of philosophy papers in journals are like that. Whereas each of Quine's papers is just a small picture, a small window onto a giant picture, which is his whole theory, and it's got all of these elements that hang together. Probably the best thing to read to get his theory, or at least the theory, the most famous version of the theory, is his 1960 book, Word and Object, which, of course, came after Two Dogmas of Empiricism and perhaps goes even further down the road that Two Dogmas went down. But, he writes articles, he writes books, and they're all sort of little pieces of this giant picture. The other thing that kind of makes him a distinctive figure about the 20th century is that he stretched almost exactly the length of the 20th century. He was born in 1908, died in 1999, I believe I'm right in saying. And was still publishing up until the end. For example, this book, Pursuit of Truth, which is more accessible than many of his books, although it's a slim volume, was published in the early 90s. The second edition, I think, 1992. And it's still beautifully written. I think I'm going to read you the beginning sentence of this to give you some idea of, because it sort of hints at a lot of the themes in Quine. From impacts on our sensory surfaces, we in our collective and cumulative creativity down the generations have projected our systematic theory of the external world. Our system is proving successful in predicting subsequent sensory input. How have we done it? Okay, that hints at a lot of themes in Quine. One of them, and perhaps the most important, is naturalism. Now, for Quine, naturalism is the idea that there is sort of a single theory of the world. There aren't really separate disciplines. So if you do philosophy of science, there's a debate about whether or not the hard sciences are doing something different in kind from the softer sciences. And is history history a social science? Are social sciences sciences? You get into all these debates and people draw lines and so on. For Quine, it's much simpler than that. It's an overall theory of the world. Now, so it's a matter of degree. Philosophy isn't a separate thing. It's part of this whole approach. And the point of our total theory of the world is to work from inputs to make predictions, to explain the inputs and to make predictions about future inputs. And of course, this is something he shares with the logical positivists, a keenness for science. The logical positivists, as I said, were writing at a time when, Einstein was alive and making new contributions, quantum mechanics, all that stuff. Incredibly exciting time where science was making advances by leaps and bounds, and it seemed to the logical positivists that philosophy was kind of stultifying. It was stuck. It hadn't made progress. So that's why they came up with their verificationist criterion of meaning, that in order to be meaningful, something must be clear what kind of sentences about the world, what kind of statements about the world, facts about the world, contribute to its truth or falsity. So if nothing about the world affects whether or not a sentence you're saying is true or false, then either, according to the logical positivists, you're stating an analytic truth that is true in virtue of the meanings of the words contained within, like all bachelors are unmarried, or you're stating nonsense. And as we saw, the logical positivists thought that huge swathes of what had been counted respectable academic discussion were in fact nonsense and bullshit and should be trashed. In this, they were following David Hume, who'd made a very similar claim centuries before. But for example, so to give an example, A.J. Ayer, who was our sort of English language popularizer of logical positivism, says that he's not an atheist because an atheist believe that God does not exist is a meaningful sentence, whereas Ayer, doesn't think that any talk of God is meaningful because it fails the verification standard. You cannot, there are no facts about the world that would refute, that would affect either positively or negatively the truth of God exists. Okay, so part of the positivist project rests on these distinctions that we've come across before. There's a set of pairs of distinctions that have been seen as very significant down through the history of Western philosophy. There's analytic versus synthetic. This is to do with meaning. And for the logical positivists, as for thinkers before them, analytic sentences are ones that are true merely in virtue of the words involved. And that, so for example, Ayer would say, experience is relevant to the confirmation of individual synthetic statements, like grass is green, but not analytic sentences, like all bachelors are unmarried. So, in other words, synthetic statements are ones that are actually saying something about the world because they can be verified or falsified by facts about the world, whereas analytic statements are not. So this kind of robs analytic statements of some significance because they're like true by definition. Now, the positivists didn't think that this was necessarily a bad thing because they thought that math, all the statements of math were analytic. And in fact, they said that what philosophy was doing was trying to find interesting analytic truths. So philosophers still had a job to do. Philosophy wasn't nonsense, like theology, for example. But its role was limited to talking about analytic truths because the scientists were dealing with synthetic truths. Scientists had the best equipment for testing the world and coming up with new claims about the world, like electrons exist or something like that. So there's this clean divide between sentences whose meaning is unaffected by facts about the world because its meaning is solely dependent on the words that make it up, true by definition, and sentences that are actually meaningful because they're saying something about the world. This is the analytic-synthetic distinction, and it is the first of the two dogmas of empiricism that Quine is attacking. But notice, as I said, he actually agrees with the logical positivists about a lot of things. For example, Quine is a huge fan of science. Science is perhaps the most important part of this total theory of the world. But where he disagrees with the logical positivists is in this idea that there's a clear dividing line. Here's science, here's philosophy. Science is doing empirical stuff, philosophy is doing analytic stuff. And in fact, because he denies that there's a distinction, Quine has interesting ideas about the way philosophy should proceed. A famous work of his is called Epistemology Naturalized. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that typically has been concerned with questions of knowledge. That's what epistemology is about. What can we know? And a lot of epistemology before Quine was devoted to sort of analyzing the notion of knowledge. What is it to know something? And coming up with a definition of knowledge. Quine is not interested in that at all. He says that epistemology should be about sort of more nitty-gritty issues like how it is that children learn a theory of the world. It should be like a branch of science where we're studying how humans acquire information. So it should be done like science. It is naturalized. In other words, it is a branch of what we would normally call science. And part of that follows from him denying that there is a clear distinction between analytic and synthetic. So that's one pair, analytic, synthetic. That's a semantic distinction between how the meanings of sentences are determined. According to the positivists with their verification standard, analytic sentences are not verified by experience. They're true by definition. Synthetic sentences are verified by experience. Okay. There are two other related distinctions. There's the a priori versus a posteriori. This is an epistemological distinction. That is, so knowledge a priori is supposedly knowledge that you have without any experience. Now, if you've taken an early modern class, you will notice that there's a big divide between the empiricists, like Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, who minimize the amount of a priori truth to essentially nothing. They say we are born tabula rasa, which is Latin for blank slates. We don't know anything, and everything all the knowledge we have have to have acquired by sensory inputs. So empiricism is the idea that the important knowledge comes from experience, comes from sensory inputs. Quine is an empiricist. Even though he's talking about two dogmas of empiricism, that doesn't mean that he's saying empiricism is what's bad. He's saying these things that empiricists have believed have held back empiricism. And in fact, we should get rid of these dogmas and we will improve empiricism. So he's a big fan of empiricism. And that's clear, actually, from that opening sentence that I just read you. I will read it to you again. He says, from impacts on our sensory surfaces, we in our collective and cumulative creativity down the generations have projected our systematic theory of the external world. So, you know, that's an empiricist statement. It says that where we get our information is impacts on our sensory surfaces. So a priori versus a posteriori seems to be, it's a different distinction than analytic synthetic. Analytic synthetic is about meanings. A priori versus a posteriori is about knowledge, how we can know things. But with some rare exceptions like Kant, they're taken to track each other. So it was assumed that all a priori truths were analytic truths and vice versa. And the third distinction is sometimes called a metaphysical distinction. It's a fact about the world. And it's a distinction between necessary and contingent. So a necessary truth is one that cannot possibly be false, and a contingent truth is one that is in fact true but could be otherwise. So grass is green, of course, is contingently true. It is true, but there is no contradiction in imagining blue grass. That isn't a contradiction in terms. So you can see that this is very close to the idea of analytic. A contradiction in terms is how we would explain the denying an analytic truth. All right, so we've got these three pairs. Analytic synthetic, a priori, a posteriori, and necessary and contingent. And the synthetic, a posteriori, and contingent are taken to all overlap, and the analytic, a priori, and necessary are taken to all overlap. But there has to be a distinction between them for the logical positivists' project to go through, because they want to make this clear dividing line between sentences that actually say stuff about the real world and the kind of stuff that math and philosophy does. It's still valuable, but it's different in kind from what natural science does. So these claims are held by the logical positivists. The logical positivists actually make one further claim about these three pairs of concepts. They claim that the most basic of the three pairs is the analytic synthetic, and that you can explain the other two in terms of that. So all necessary and a priori truths are analytic. And analyticity is needed to explain necessity. In other words, so not only they're not just claiming that all three overlap, they're also claiming that one of them is explanatorily prior. So analyticity is the key that explains, it's the foundation that explains necessary and a priori. So if you believe that, then it better be the case that you can give an account of analyticity that is independent of your account of necessity and a prioricity, because you're saying that what explains necessity and a prioricity is analyticity. So you better not do it in reverse, otherwise you're doing circular reasoning. And that is exactly what Quine said is going on. Quine, in the early sections of this paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, actually says, okay, let's see if we can come up with the independent explanation of what it is to be analytic that the positivists need in order to explain the other two and in order to make this clear-cut distinction. And he says, okay, analyticity, an analytic truth is one that, well, an obvious example of an analytic truth, particularly if you're a big fan of logic, which Quine was actually. Quine wrote his dissertation on Russell and Whitehead's famous book, Principia Mathematica, which is practically all logic. So Quine made contributions to logic, and that's how he started out. So big fan of logic. He says, well, the best candidate for analyticity is logical truth, because it's clear that P or not P is true by definition. That is, P or not P is something that is true in all possible circumstances, because if you assume, as Quine does, and as logic, certainly the logic that he was dealing with does, that P has to be true or false. Well, even if you don't know the truth of P, P has to be true or false, and not P has to be the opposite. And in a disjunction, if one of them is true, then the whole thing is true. But in P or not P, one of them has to be true, because P is either true, in which case it's true and the whole disjunction is true, or P is false, in which case not P is true, in which case the whole disjunction is true. So that's known as a logical tautology, something that has to be true. If that's what analyticity was, then we do have a coherent notion of it. But the trouble is that's a very narrow set of sentences, and that doesn't include things like all bachelors are unmarried, because that's not P or not P. So for that to count as also like a logical truth, you need to be able to translate statements like all bachelors are unmarried into a logical truth, which it isn't so far. All bachelors are unmarried is not on its face a logical truth, a tautology. But if you can translate it into one, then that logical truth or anything translatable into a logical truth would be the kind of explanation of analyticity that the positivists could use, and it would save their project. The trouble is, in order to translate something like all bachelors are unmarried into a logical truth, you need the notion of synonymy. You need to be able to say, well, bachelor means the same as unmarried man. So you need a notion of synonymy. So in other words, before you can explain necessary and a priori in terms of analyticity, you need to explain analyticity in terms of synonymy. But it better not be the case that synonymy is relying on a notion of necessity and a priority. Otherwise, you've still got the circle going on, and you haven't explained any of them. It's a bit like there's a famous story about a dictionary that has a definition of grass that says grass is the stuff that grazing animals eat. So suppose you want to know, is wheat a grass? I better look up the definition of grass. So you look up the definition of grass. Grass is what grazing animals eat. Have you learned what grass is yet? Well, it depends on the definition of grazing. So you look up grazing and it says eating grass. You haven't learned anything because it's circular. If the same thing is happening with analyticity and necessity and a prioricity, then none of them have been explained and they're empty concepts, according to Quine. Okay, so here's this suggestion. We can explain analyticity as logical truth or sentences that can be translated into logical truths. Well, the idea of translation requires synonymy, because if you're going to translate one sentence into another, they have to be synonymous. Okay, what's synonymy? Well, here's a promising suggestion for synonymy. Synonymy is intersubstitutivity salva veritate. This is Leibniz's phrase. It means two phrases are synonymous if, for any sentence that is true, you can replace one of the phrases with the other without affecting the truth value of the sentences. So, all unmarried men are unmarried. Take out unmarried man and replace by bachelor, and you get all bachelors are unmarried, and it looks like you don't change the truth value of the sentence. So it looks like, hey, we've got something here. We've got a standard for explaining synonymy, which we can then use to explain analyticity, which we can use to explain these other two. The trouble is, as Quine says, you've got to make a distinction between sentences of what's called an extensional language, like logic. Logic is an extensional language. That is, extensional means, well, it just, meaning is explained in terms of reference. So, for example, logic explains what green is extensionally. So if you talk about a predicate in logic, like green, all that there is to the predicate green is not some notion of greenness, but rather all the green things. So what is the meaning of green in an extensional language? It's all the green things. The trouble with that is two terms that we would say are not synonymous have the same extension. That is, the same group of objects are covered by them. So according to an extensional theory, they mean the same. But renate, which means having kidneys, and caudate, which means having a heart, are true of the same group of animals. All the animals that are renate are caudate. So this notion of synonymy would produce the result that renate is synonymous with caudate. And of course it isn't. We know that renate and caudate mean two different things. Creature with a heart is different from creature with the kidneys. So this would, if this worked, it would solve the problem, because this is an independent, non-circular definition of synonymy. Trouble is, it doesn't explain our concept of synonymy. An extensional language doesn't work. What about an intentional language? Extensional, intentional, it's like the distinction, like Frege's distinction between sense and reference. Reference is extensional, sense is intentional. Well, intentional languages like English is intentional, have these contexts called modal contexts that use, like, it is necessary that. So if we're allowed to use intersubstitutivity into intentional languages, then renate and caudate are not intersubstitutional salva veritate. Because it is not it is true that it is necessary that all caudates are caudate. That's true. But if you take out caudate and replace it with renate, it is not true that it is necessary that all renates are caudate. Because it's possible we can imagine an animal with a heart but no kidneys. There aren't any in the real world, which is what an extensional language deals with, but we can imagine one possibly. So this, if we're allowed to use intentional concepts, then not only does synonymy as intersubstitutivity salva veritate appear to give an independent definition of analyticity, which we need, but it also appears to match our notion, our intuitive notion of synonymy, because it says the bachelor and unmarried man are synonymous, but renate and caudate aren't. Gives the right results. But of course, it uses the notion of necessity, which is supposedly being explained by analyticity, so it's circular. So you face a dilemma in trying to explain synonymy. Either you come up with this version of synonymy that doesn't match what we want it to, which Quine is going to say, actually, that's your best bet. This, if you're going to use the notion of synonymy, this is the best you can do, which is going to produce some very radical effects that is related to its indeterminacy of translation, as we'll see in a second. Or you try and get it closer to our intuitive notion, but then you've still got the circle. So consequently, we should abandon this analytic-synthetic distinction. We cannot make a clear distinction. Now, Grice and Strawson, whom we've come across, this is Paul Grice and Peter Strawson, or H.P. Grice and P.F. Strawson, as they're usually known, who are part of the ordinary language school, which is flourishing in Oxford at the same time that Quine is writing. Now, the ordinary language school in Oxford is influenced by the later Wittgenstein. The later Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations and the Blue and Brown books and various others rejects most of what the early Wittgenstein of the Tractatus says. But it's the early Wittgenstein of the Tractatus who was very influential on the logical positivists. So if you follow all that, you can see that Grice and Strawson are no fans of logical positivism. However, they retain these claims of logical positivism, because even though they reject the verificationist theory of meaning, and for example, Grice has his account of meaning in terms of utterers' intentions, and in general they talk about meaning as something that humans do. That's Strawson's notion of referring rather than denoting, which is Russell talks about denoting, which is what sentences do. Strawson talks about referring, which is what people do. So they're no fans of logical positivism, and yet they do share these two claims. I'm drawing on the work of Scott Soames in saying this. In fact, I'm presenting you Scott Soames's analysis from his book on analytic philosophy. And I'll say a little bit about his suggestion for an alternative version of synonymy that appears to not rely on necessity and therefore might appear to dodge the circle. We can talk about that in a minute. But anyway, Grice and Strawson write this famous paper, A Defense of a Dogma. And the dogma they're talking about is the first one, the analytic-synthetic distinction. Because when Quine produces this argument against the analytic-synthetic distinction, it's incredibly radical, because this is a distinction that has been agreed on for hundreds of years, and hundreds of very different philosophers, the empiricists and the rationalists, have agreed on this distinction, that you can distinguish clearly between analytic truths and synthetic truths. It's just, there's an obvious and very useful distinction. And they say, look, so now all you've done, Quine, is you've shown, at best, what you've shown is that you can't define analytic without using necessary, and or vice versa, and the same for a prioricity. In other words, they're sort of in a circle. But just because you can't define them without getting out of a circle doesn't mean that there aren't obvious examples of analytic truths and obvious examples of necessary truths. So maybe we can't define them, but we can say, we can point to, okay, I can't give a good definition of it, but I know that that's one and that's the other. This is very similar to a classic quote from a Supreme Court justice where a case came up about whether a particular piece of artwork was art or pornography. And if it's art, it's protected by the First Amendment, and if it's pornography, it's not protected. So you need to be able to distinguish between art and pornography. Both of them can involve nudity, both of them can involve depicting sex acts. So how do you distinguish it? And famously, the Supreme Court justice says, I know it when I see it. So what he's saying is exactly what Grice and Strawson are saying. Even if we can't give a good definition of it, that doesn't mean there isn't a difference. I know that that's pornography and that's art. I know that that's analytic and that's synthetic. And they point to not just the fact that there has been consistent usage of these, but also that you can teach them to students and say, this is an analytic and this is synthetic. Got it now? Okay, and then you can give them new examples that they haven't encountered before, and they all sort them into the same groups. So clearly they have mastered a concept that they can apply to novel instances, and they all produce the same results, which is good evidence that it's a genuine concept. Because if it was just made up bullshit, then they would be getting it random. They wouldn't get the same distinctions. They would just process them randomly. But they have mastered something. And of course, this is very important if you believe, as the later Wittgenstein did, and so Grice and Strawson were influenced by that, that meaning is use. If they can use it in the same way, then it is a meaningful distinction. And the other point that they make, is that if you get rid of the notion of synonymy, as Quine is doing here, as part of his attack on analyticity, this is much more radical than Quine lets on in Two Dogmas, because it appears to undermine the very notion of meaning itself. Because if you can't say, what is it to say that two things are synonymous? They mean the same. If you cannot, if there is no notion of synonymy, then there is no notion of means the same as. And if there's no notion of means the same as, then we can't say what something means. Because if we could say what something means, then there would be a notion of means the same as. Because if we can say what this means, and it means that what this means, then we could explain synonymy in the terms of, well, those things both mean the same. So if we haven't got synonymy, that shows that we can't have meaning, because if we did have meaning, we'd have synonymy. So if there's no synonymy, there is no meaning, and that's just absurd, say Grice and Strawson. So there must be something wrong with your argument attacking this distinction, Quine. Well, hold my beer, says Quine, except he didn't, because that cliche hadn't come up then. Quine's more of a martini drinker. He was a pretty heavy drinker, I'm told, but yeah, it would have been martinis. I mean, picture Quine as the madman era. He was very much into wearing suits and drinking martinis. Anyway, so Two Dogmas comes out early 50s. This comes out as a response. And then in 1960, Quine publishes Word and Object, where he makes clear his theory of indeterminacy of translation. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but let me just, before we leave this attack on the first dogma, Soames, in the chapter where he's talking about, the first chapter, the chapter where he's talking about this dogma, he suggests Quine has ignored a possible definition of synonymy. Instead of using the context, it is necessary that, which of course relies on necessary and maintains the circle, you could say X believes that. So for example, the other thing with it is necessary that is some necessary truths don't appear to be analytic truths, because analytic truths appear to be narrower than necessary truth. Now, in saying this, Soames is denying that analyticity and necessity match up exactly. So he's abandoning these. And the reason why Quine didn't consider this is because he and the positivists basically shared these assumptions. But what Soames is suggesting is that if we give up the idea that analyticity and necessity perfectly match up, then we can come up with a definition in terms of believes that. I should give some context here. Quine publishes Word and Object in 1960. Quine basically rules the 60s, but in 1970, Kripke comes on the scene, and Kripke in the lectures that he gives in 1970 that are published in 1980 as the book Naming a Necessity, gives an account of necessity that marks it as completely independent from analyticity and a priori. And in fact, Kripke argues that they don't line up neatly, and argues that you can have a posteriori necessary truths. So that goes across the divide. Like, for example, Hesperus is phosphorus. That is, the morning star, the thing that the Greeks named Hesperus, which is the evening star, is the same thing that the Greeks named phosphorus, which is the morning star. They're both the planet Venus. That is something that has to be learned a posteriori. You can't know that a priori without experience. And yet it is a necessary truth, according to Kripke's account. And Kripke's account was very influential, and Soames clearly agrees with it. So it's no problem if we end up with a concept of analyticity that is narrower than necessity. Now he says X believes blank. So if is it true that X believes that renate X believes that renates are renate? That's true. X believes that renates are chordate. That's false. So that produces the right result that renate and chordate are not synonymous. But the trouble with this is, if we allow X believes that, these are called propositional attitude contexts, it will remove a lot of the truths of mathematics from being analytic truths. And it will also remove anything interesting as an analytic truth, because X is only going to believe that something is you're only going to get exactly the same result in these contexts for things that the average person can instantly see are the same. So in other words, you're not even going to get like 2 to the power 8 and 256 as synonymous, because not everybody can understand that. So they understand 256, but they won't know that that's replaceable in all instances with 2 to the power 8. So this is going to produce a much narrower range of analytic truths. And as the positivists wanted to reserve a lot of interesting and surprising analytic truths as the province of philosophy, all of those would kind of disappear under this version of analyticity, and philosophy, the role that was set aside for philosophy, would just vanish under this definition. Okay, dogma number 2, the second of the 2 dogmas of empiricism, radical reductionism. And it's very much related to the idea of synthetic truth. So if a synthetic truth is one that can be falsified by experience. Now, this will include a lot of the generalizations of science, which are not necessarily immediately falsifiable. So obviously testable synthetic propositions are, that dog is brown, because you can go and examine the dog closely to see what color it is. But generalizations of science, F equals MA, are going to require a set of other conditions that specify the appropriate conditions for experimentally testing them. And it's only when you add all of those assumptions to the claim F equals MA that that it becomes testable. However, what the positivists thought is that basically you could take a synthetic claim, add a bunch of other analytic claims, so have the synthetic claim plus a bunch of other things, and it will logically imply something that if we can observe the negation of that, then that will falsify the synthetic claim. And because it can be falsified or confirmed, it is a synthetic truth. It is susceptible to being tested by experience. So, someone like Ayer would say, and this is again taken from Soames, experience is relevant to the confirmation of individual synthetic but not analytic sentences. Now, Quine points out that the logical positivists are the heirs of the empiricists, the British empiricists like Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. And the British empiricist says the meanings of individual terms are our sensory experiences. So something like red is explained in terms of our sensory experiences. What the logical positivists did that was an advance on those 18th century thinkers is say that it's not the individual words that are testable, that are the meaning of which we learn from our experience. It's sentences. And that's important because an obvious problem for empiricists is what about words that don't talk about the world? What about and or and things like that? If you're going to say to be meaningful, they have to be susceptible, they have to be testable by experience, what do you do with that? The logical positivists, and under the influence of someone like Russell, have come up with ways to explain the meanings, an extra way to explain the meanings, role that they play in sentences. But still, the unit of meaning is the sentence. So according to the logical positivists, words have meaning merely because of the role they play in a sentence. And if you remember, Russell's theory of descriptions said that his analysis of a definite description like the King of France didn't have meaning by itself in abstraction because it doesn't actually pick out anything in the real world. It only had meaning when you put it in a sentence. So in other words, the meaning of a term is acquired from the sentence. It's the sentence that is the vehicle of meaning. Quine says good advance, logical positivists, on going from words as the unit of meaning to sentences as the unit of meaning, but you didn't go far enough. In fact, the unit of meaning is not individual sentences, it's our entire theory of the world. That is the thing that's meaningful, and sentences, insofar as they're meaningful, acquire their meaning in the context of the entire theory. So just as the positivists said words acquire meaning in the context of a sentence, so Quine says sentences acquire meaning in the context of the theory itself. This is part of his holism, which I'm going to explain in a bit more detail. All right, so Ayer says, experience is relevant to the confirmation of individual synthetic but not analytic sentences. Quine, of course, has said that we can't make this distinction. And in fact, it is never, experience is never relevant to the confirmation of individual sentences. Experience is relevant to the confirmation of the total theory. So we have a total theory of the world that makes predictions about the world. And experience is relevant to the confirmation of that, but not to individual sentences. What does he mean? Well, you might think, okay, look, I can imagine Ayer must be right, because think of a synthetic sentence like, I don't know, that dog is brown or whatever. Surely that is confirmable or deniable by sensory experience going over and looking at the damn dog. Surely that will determine whether or not that individual sentence by itself is true or false. Quine says no, it's not that simple, because our experience, except in very rare sentences, actually, Quine says that there are sentences that are like what Ayer says are all synthetic sentences. They're called observation sentences, and they're very specific, and they're at the sort of periphery of our theory. Quine has this analogy that our theory is like an upturned bowl. Actually, he uses the analogy of web, where if you take a bowl and you turn it upside down, and the edge of the bowl is where our theory of the world interacts with the world. So the world is the table, the bowl is our theory of it. There's an edge where they interact, and that is observation sentences, where they are directly confirmable or deniable. But they are very specific and very narrow. They wouldn't even be things like there is a brown dog there. They would be, depending on your theory, they would be having a certain kind of experience. So, you know, having Quine disagrees with the classic empiricist because he's a Gestalt empiricist. He doesn't believe that we have like 2D experiences. We can have 3D experiences at once. So he disagrees in the content of sensory input. But he does agree that that observation sentences are confirmed or denied by our sensory experience. Okay, the vast majority of all of our statements are going to be not observation sentences. They're going to be part of the bowl. At the top of the bowl, at the most furthest removed from the edge, are our most theoretic sentences, like Aristotle's laws of thought, like the law of non-contradiction. Now, Quine thinks that any non-observation sentence, which is the vast majority of them, can be held true or can be rejected on the basis of any experience. What the hell is he talking about? Well, here is an example that is making a slightly different point, but I've always loved this example because it's a really good illustration of why it is that sensory experience isn't directly relevant to specific claims. It's relevant to a bunch of claims, any one of which we can choose to reject. We are not forced to say, okay, that experience made us reject that statement. That experience might be definitely inconsistent with our current theory, but we can make our current theory consistent with that experience by changing any one of a number of claims within our theory, not necessarily that isn't a brown dot. And this example is due to a philosopher of science called Imre Lakatos. The story is about an imaginary case of planetary misbehavior. A physicist of the pre-Einsteinian era takes Newton mechanics and his law of gravitation, the accepted initial conditions, and calculates, with their help, the path of a newly discovered small planet. But, so he says, according to Newton's science, the planet should move like this. It doesn't. Now you might say, okay, we have to change something. Now already you could say, well, do I change my theory? Do I reject Newton's theory and look for a new one, like Einstein's? Or do I assume that I've measured it wrong? Well, actually, those aren't your only choices. But the planet deviates from the calculated path. Does our Newtonian physicist consider that the deviation was forbidden by Newton's theory and therefore that once established it refutes Newton's theory? No. He suggests that there must be a hitherto unknown planet P star which perturbs the planet of P, the path of P, the original planet. He calculates the mass, orbit, etc. of this hypothetical planet and then asks an experimental astronomer to test his hypothesis. The planet P star is so small that even the biggest available telescopes cannot possibly observe it. The experimental astronomer applies for a research grant to build yet a bigger one. In 3 years' time, the new telescope is ready. Were the unknown planet P star to be discovered, it would be hailed as a new victory of Newtonian science. But it is not. Does our scientist abandon Newton's theory and his idea of the perturbing planet? No. He suggests that a cloud of cosmic dust hides the planet from us. He calculates the location and property of this cloud and asks for a research grant to send a satellite to test his calculation. You can see that this goes on and on. In other words, what he's doing is he's making a decision which of his sentences about the external world to hold true and which to revise. He is unwilling to reject Newtonian science despite evidence that appears to contradict it. And that's perfectly okay according to Quine, because you cannot say that some of the sentences are synthetic and have to be the ones that are revised, and some are analytic. Any sentence can be revised according to experience. Even classic examples of analytic sentences, like you can't have P and not P, the law of non-contradiction. Quine points out, and this was actually a legitimate argument, that some discoveries of quantum mechanics appear to threaten the law of non-contradiction. Like in the two-slit experiment, electrons appear to be in two places at once. The same electron appears to be in two places at once. What do we decide? We could say, well, it's possible for something to both be and not be in a place, like Schrodinger's cat and all that stuff. And so that is a possible conclusion we could draw. We could say, given this experimental result, the two-slit experiment, we can revise one of our most central, isolated from experience sentences about the world that the logical positivists would have called analytic and therefore true by definition and immune to revision. There is no such thing, says Quine. everything can be revised. Any non-observation sentence can be held true. Any changes, so analytic sentences can be held true in face of all evidence. So they would say no evidence. Someone like Ayer would say no evidence would cause us to reject the law of contradiction, non-contradiction. But Quine said no. Any sentence, even ones that you regard as synthetic, can be held true. What are our guidelines in deciding which sentences to reject or hold true? Like in the case of the planetary observation. They're pragmatic. They're entirely pragmatic considerations. We try and minimize the damage to our theory. Now, if enough observations happen that are inconsistent with our theory, then to make our theory consistent with the observations, we will have to make central changes to our theory. But what we do is we try and we make pragmatic considerations about which to give up, which is exactly what that scientist was doing in the case of the planet. He's saying, shall I give up my theory of the path of the planet, which requires rejecting Newton's physics, or shall I give up my theory that there wasn't another planet affecting them, which was an assumption? Shall I reject that assumption? So Quine has this theory of the web of belief that our entire theory of the world is interconnected statements that we try and maintain consistency among, but our goal is to produce a theory that takes input, and which is sensory, because he's an empiricist, and produces the output of predictions about future experiences. Our goal is to maintain peak success in this. But what do we do in the face of evidence that appears to contradict claims within our total theory? Well, we make changes that minimize the damage to our theory or keep the theory simple and powerful. Indeterminacy of translation. This is another core argument of Quine's that isn't talked about in Two Dogmas of Empiricism, but it's worth mentioning because it's one of the key claims of Quine's that made him such a radical and interesting philosopher. The indeterminacy of translation is sort of, as I said, Quine saying, in response to critics like Grice and Strawson saying your attack on synonymy is an attack on meaning, Quine says, well, yeah, there is no such thing as synonymy, and let's see, let's do a little thought experiment that illustrates the real situation we're in. Quine is a behaviorist. Now, not a behaviorist in the sense of Skinner, behavioral psychology, although he probably was at the time because Skinnerian psychology was in the air. But what he definitely is to his dying day was a behaviorist about language learning. Now in this, he differs from Chomsky. Chomsky, of course, famously says we're hardwired. Chomsky is like the descendant of the rationalists who say that certain things are known a priori. Chomsky would basically say, yeah, our language talent is hardwired into us. We don't require experience to acquire that skill. It's already there. And so there's this sort of underlying structure that all languages share. Quine is going to reject that. He's a classic empiricist who says we're blank slates, we acquire information. Except in that he's a naturalist. He says if science shows that that's true, he would have to accept that. But he is a behaviorist about language acquisition. And we'll see the importance of that in his indeterminacy of translation. So what is indeterminacy of translation? Well, the most famous illustration of this is in Word and Object, and it involves a term that Quine invented, which is Gavi. So, remember, Quine is a behaviorist, certainly about language acquisition. And he says, and he asks us to imagine a field linguist. This is kind of an the linguist's equivalent of Indiana Jones. What the field linguist has to do is parachute into a remote area where we've discovered a previously undiscovered tribe who speak a language that has never been exposed to the outside world. And the field linguist's job is to visit this tribe and come away with a translation manual that can translate anything that they say into English, let's say. This is a good analogy for essentially any language acquisition, because on Quine, on empiricist assumptions, we come into the world without language, and we have to acquire language. So, if that is possible, it must be possible. It certainly must be possible for a field linguist, who is someone who already has a language, to acquire a different language, this isolated tribe's language. Okay, so the field linguist parachutes in. And how does he go about this? How does he go about learning the language? Well, all he can do, if you're an empiricist, the only evidence he's got to go on for the meanings of the words that he hears is empirical and is sensory input. So it involves pointing at things and looking at the reaction of speakers of this language. Now, Quine kind of cheats a little because he says the linguist already knows what gestures are affirmation and denial. So what he can do then is test hypotheses about the meanings of words in exactly the way that a scientist tests hypotheses about any theory he has, by looking at the evidence, because everything is science in Quine's terms. So a rabbit hops by, and one of the natives points at the rabbit and says "Gavi." Okay, now you might think, great, now our field linguist knows that Gavi is rabbit. Not so fast. First of all, he's only going to acquire the language sentences at a time, because sentences are the kind of things that have truth value, that can be affirmed or denied. So Gavi could be just an abbreviated sentence, just like a single word, or it could itself be an entire sentence. So that's one complication. But the other complication is indeterminacy of reference. That is, before I get to that, how would our field linguist confirm that Gavi means rabbit? Well, you can't just take one instance and assume that means rabbit, because of course there are many alternatives that are consistent with the evidence that he now has. So far he's got a piece of evidence which is a native pointing at a rabbit and saying Gavi. That is consistent with a whole bunch of translation manuals. You could translate Gavi as rabbit. You could translate Gavi as complete sentence, that's a rabbit. Gavi could be the name of that specific rabbit. Gavi could be, oh, there goes lunch. Gavi could be, my kid's let his pet out again. All of these are entirely consistent with the evidence that we've got so far. Now, presumably, it should be possible for the field linguist to narrow it down, to eliminate many of these possibilities. What Quine's thesis is essentially that, well, however many he eliminates, there is still going to be literally an infinite number of interpretations of the language, translation manuals of the language, that are consistent with all the information that he's acquired, but that are contradictory to each other. So in other words, you can get at least, let's say just two translation manuals, each of which is equally confirmed by the evidence, which includes, of course, the only evidence we've got so far is this one piece of evidence pointing at a rabbit and saying Gavi. You could have two translation manuals that are consistent with not only all the evidence that the field linguist ever acquires, but that the field linguist could acquire. It is still going to be the case that you have two translation manuals that are inconsistent with each other, but entirely consistent with the facts. Which of them is the right one? Quine says that's an empty question. There is no such thing as the right one, which is obviously something like what Grice and Strawson were afraid of, because we want to say, well, look, their language means something, and if it means something, it can't mean both of these things because they're inconsistent with each other. So Quine would say, then let's drop the notion of meaning. Both of these work. Our theory of the world is about what works. And so each of these, we can choose between each of these by pragmatic terms. If this one is easier to use than this one, let's pick this one. Does this mean that one's true? No, it just means it's easier for us to use. Now, what kind of things would we do to eliminate alternatives like, obviously you think, well, look, there's going to be evidence that eliminates Gavi as the name of that one particular rabbit. You find another rabbit, and you point to the other rabbit, and presumably, again, this assumes that we know how to ask a question. It assumes that, questions go up at the end of the sentence. We don't know that in this other person's language. So these are even more difficulties that Quine doesn't get into. But suppose you can say, point at another rabbit and say, Gavi, and if they say yes, then that appears to eliminate the claim that Gavi is a proper name, because they can't both be Gavi. So it looks like we can do more and more of this, and finally narrow it down. But what Quine points out with a thesis called indeterminacy of reference is there are some things that we can never eliminate, such as Gavi could mean rabbit or it could mean undetached rabbit part, because wherever, it's a bit like the renate caudate problem. Every time you're pointing at a rabbit, you're pointing at an undetached rabbit part. So every time it's true to say that he is referring to a rabbit, it is true to say that he is referring to an undetached rabbit part, and every time it's false of one, it's false of the other. So in other words, they are like extensionally equivalent. And given that we have to be a behaviorist in language acquisition because we're not telepathic, the only thing that we have to go on in learning a language is the evidence. And if the evidence cannot decide between two inconsistent translation manuals, then there is indeterminacy of translation. You cannot say one is the correct one. And of course, there's examples that you might say illustrate this, in that there are genuinely inconsistent translations of, say, the Bible. The further away from us a language is written in, the greater leeway there is in translating, in what's a correct translation of it. But Quine, it's worse than that, because Quine says indeterminacy of translation happens within a language. I am translating what you mean by your words into what makes sense for me, and somebody else could take by your words you to mean something inconsistent with what I take it, and both of them are consistent with the evidence, and we can't say that one of them is wrong and the other one is right. So this is a very radical kind of skepticism about notion of meaning as we normally understand it. We're replacing meaning with some kind of behaviorist stand-in that doesn't do what we think meaning should. But Quine says, if we're honest, this is the best we can do. And this brought a storm of criticism and commentary on Quine, which is one of the reasons he's so famous, because he's making radical claims. He's also pretty cool. Everybody should go through a Quine phase of thinking that Quine's right about something. Now, most philosophers, there aren't many Quinians left, probably maybe not as few as there are logical positivists left, but he still has his defenders, And but his view he's not sort of as current as he was in the mid-century. In the mid-century, everybody was talking, if they weren't agreeing with Quine, they were disagreeing with Quine. They were talking about Quine. So that's why I have to know about him. He was such an important figure.